Welcome to Rehash, a Web3 podcast.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Rehash, a Web3 podcast. I'm your host, Diana Chen, and today we're speaking with Julia Rosenberg and Chase Chapman from Metropolis, formerly Orca, about all things DAOs, including governance, DAOs as cities, human-centric design, and a lot more. But before we dive into our conversation with Julia and Chase, here's a quick word from the Web3 projects that helped make this season possible.
Web2 Social has become a world of walled gardens, where platforms own your data, your content, and your community. But Lens Protocol is a community garden, a user-owned, composable, and decentralized ecosystem designed to let Web3 social apps bloom. When you create content on Lens, you own it, you control it, you take it with you from app to app, and you decide how it's monetized. Instead of chasing ads and algorithms, you set the value of your work, and your community collects it directly from you. Here at Rehash, we'll be experimenting with this ourselves by posting all content from Season 3 on Lens, where our community can now truly interact and grow with us. So bring your photos and videos, your GMs, and your friends, and come join the new era of social media on Lens Protocol. Go to claim.lens.xyz to claim the last social media handle you'll ever need. And be sure to follow rehash.lens.
Contributing to a DAO can feel like this. Contributing to several DAOs can feel like this. But it doesn't have to. With Avenue, you can filter out the noise, get to know more DAOs, and start contributing right away. Avenue allows contributors to form organic teams to work together on the things they love. This means DAOs can operate, coordinate, and collaborate at a scale that used to be impossible. Because working together in a DAO should be like making music. The drummers drum, the singers sing, and when collaboration leads the way, a song emerges. No more relying on the core team to get things done. It's time to get your community contributing. To give your DAO the information they need to know, the tools they need to self-organize, and the spaces they need to work together, visit avenue.place.
Hey guys, thanks for hopping on here. I just wanted to touch base real quick.
What's up, Diane?
What's up? So first of all, I just wanted to say thanks, Tyler, for taking these meeting notes. They look great.
I didn't take those. I'll take credit for it, though.
Wait, that wasn't you? Do we know who it was? And who's been posting those hilarious meme videos on our Twitter?
Oh, I have no idea. There's a lot going on here, though. Like, how are we supposed to keep up with what everyone's doing?
I don't know. It feels like pure chaos being in a DAO sometimes. Ellie, what was that thing you were talking about that helps DAO contributors add and organize all of their contributions?
Oh yeah, it's called Govern. It's like GitHub for DAO contributors.
Ooh, that sounds cool. How does it actually work?
Yeah, so it's actually a protocol where DAO members can add any task they've completed as a contribution. And then their fellow DAO members can attest to them to confirm that those contributions were valid without the need for a core team to do so. What you end up with is a simple bottom-up way for members to build out the DAO's contribution graph themselves. It gives contributors more power and freedom, it makes it a lot easier to accurately reward everyone. DAO members actually own all of their contributions, so if they want to jump into another DAO, they can actually prove they know their stuff.
Okay, I'm sold. Can it be on chain?
Of course, but on Gnosis chain, so transactions are super cheap.
Ooh. All right, yeah, I'm down. Diane?
Yeah, for sure. Let's set it up. What's the link, Ellie?
Just go to govern.app, and that's govern without the E, so GOVRN.app.
Perfect. All right, well, if you guys got this, I gotta jump back to another call. Julia and Chase, welcome to the pod. How are you both?
Excited to chat.
Okay, well, Julia, I'm going to start with you. For those who don't know you, can you just tell us a little bit about your background first and foremost and how you got into DAOs?
Yes. So I am co-founder at Metropolis, and I was sort of startup workshopping for a while in the consumer social space, and essentially just got frustrated with Web2 scaling models. So in my sort of startup journey, my co-founder, John, and I ended up exploring crypto more deeply. And John sort of gave me exposure to it since he was a smart contract developer. And I was genuinely just extremely excited by the opportunity that crypto enabled for more interesting and dynamic scaling solutions for organizations, communities, groups of people, which is, I think, an under-tapped area of development within the crypto industry. It's just how we're building out relational data and organizational data through blockchain. So that is sort of how I backed into Metropolis, previously Orca. But yeah, I think it's still just been a journey and us uncovering that layer that has yet to be fully tapped on.
Yeah, I think that's a super underrated aspect of DAOs. And I mean, you could argue that there are a lot of underrated aspects right now since DAOs are still relatively new and a lot of things people still aren't thinking about. But I think you guys are thinking about all of the right things. Chase, what about you? Can you tell us a little bit about your background for people who don't know you and how you got into DAOs?
Yes. I got into crypto basically when I was working in marketing, doing like data analytics. Came across the blockchain, which was being proposed as this like amazing solution to data provenance. Sort of fell down the rabbit hole from there and got really excited about all of the possibilities in the space. Started a developer tooling company when I was in college. Ended up sort of stepping back from that when I graduated and went like full blown into the DAO ecosystem. Started basically contributing to DAOs full time and doing research alongside that, sort of pulling from my experiences, what I was seeing DAOs struggle with, and then also what companies and co-ops and governments struggle with, and really started sharing some of that research, started a podcast on that, plus sort of the human side of Web3. And then ultimately had Julia on my podcast, started loving what at the time was called Orca, now Metropolis was building and doing. And a lot of my research sort of ended up validating a lot of those things that I felt like pods really address, which I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about. But yeah, fell in love with the DAO ecosystem. Felt like it was sort of this really interesting intersection of like humans, politics, and like sort of psychology and economics all in one. And so I've been thinking about DAOs ever since.
I love it. And you are very well known on crypto Twitter as the DAO girl. You were working full-time DAOs for a little bit, which is very impressive in and of itself. And this is just the dream team that I'm looking at now with you and Julia. So I want to dive into a lot of what you guys both talked about. What are pods? What is Metropolis? What is with the rebrand from Orca to Metropolis? All of that good stuff. The first thing I want to talk about, though, is specifically honing in on DAO governance a little bit, a topic that I know both of you have thought really in depth about. I think when we talk about governance, a good starting point would be to talk about some of the traditional governance models that we've seen used in history, whether in companies or in government or in the formation of nation states. And so can you guys talk about some of the traditional governance models that we've seen, sort of describe what they are? I'm sure a lot of these words are going to sound familiar to people, but maybe they won't understand exactly what it means, like holacracy, that's thrown around a lot, sociocracy, autocracy, all of these different types of governance. Can you sort of highlight some of the key ones that we've seen in history and explain briefly what they mean? And then we'll get into sort of like how they apply to DAOs today, or maybe don't apply as much as, people think they should.
So I think when we think about like governance more broadly and why we even do it, I think it's just important to like lay a foundation there, which is basically how do we make decisions as groups of people and who do we trust to make those decisions? So I think when you look at everything from like the idea of the Leviathan and a government needing to be this like really strong, authoritative figure that's able to make sure that people are following the rules, all the way up to more democratic spaces where you actually give the people who live in certain areas the ability to have a say in decisions that are made and all of these types of things. Ultimately, what all of that stuff comes down to is how do we make decisions that impact us and the environment that we're in? And so I think when you think about the evolution from like monarchies to democracies, we see a lot of that stuff also happening in digital spaces where for the last, few decades, we've had very large companies like Facebook basically have like really huge amounts of influence and power over the digital spaces that we exist in. And so I think to contextualize DAOs and all of that, what we're really starting to see is this movement towards more democratic digital spaces, acknowledging that if we're going to spend huge amounts of our time online, like a large chunk of our lives are going to be in digital spaces. How can we make sure that we have a say in the spaces that we're existing within and helping govern those spaces? And so I think DAOs are very much this movement towards more democratic spaces. We're experimenting with things like holacracy and sociocracy and token voting and all of those types of things. Ultimately, I think those are all just flavors of more democratic systems. Julia, I don't know if you have other thoughts on that.
No, I think that what Chase is also calling attention to is that we're really building a new design space to explore all of these models. And I think that's what's more interesting. Like, I actually care less about the structures that DAOs take on. And I think that what we care more about with Metropolis is that all organizations have a shape, and we're more stressing the importance to define those shapes. But I think, we have a really cool opportunity with DAOs today because we have completely open design space. Whereas in the traditional systems, like Chase kind of pointed out, whether that be a traditional legal system or Web2 digital spaces, both of those spaces accommodate certain models and certain shapes of governance or organizations. And I think why we've seen this birth around like holacracy and autocracy and sociocracy and all of these things is that our traditional structures don't really accommodate those types of systems, which is why I think we've seen this birth around some of the socialware and some of the social systems that DAOs can enable because it offers a greater design space than the legal system, which is directly set up to support like an LLC and a limited stock company and, all of these models that have become pretty standardized.
Could you dive into that a little bit more when you say like some of the traditional systems that we've seen with governance aren't really serving us in the context of DAOs or even in digital spaces generally, and why you think that's the case?
Yeah, I mean, I have gone on many rants of this, and I think that everyone has been burned by corporate America in their own unique way. But I think like the biggest trend we've seen is the corporate model is to just continue scaling and get bigger and bigger and bigger. And what we've come to realize is that doesn't actually mean more productivity or more efficiency. And I think that we're sort of in a model of regression with some of these large corporations, with Amazon and Facebook and basically the FANGs of the world that are actually having to scale down pretty tremendously because of more macroeconomic conditions, but also realizing that they need to trim the fat a little bit, that you don't actually need 4 product managers to do a single product manager's job, and that there's actually a lot of operational debt within these organizations. And so I think we've kind of just reached like the scaling end of the models we've seen in the traditional world. We haven't really figured out other ways to scale even further beyond where they've come to this point. And I think that's where we have a really unique opportunity with DAOs and enabling the use of blockchain technology, which is such a boomer way to put it. But we sort of see that as the next scaling layer for organizations.
Yeah, and I really like your framing of, sort of zooming out from governance specifically and just thinking about design in general and what design systems we're using for DAOs. And like you said, every DAO is different. And so it's not so much about like, what is the playbook? What is the best way to design a DAO? Like there's no answer to that. But when you think about DAO design, are there any general principles or guidelines that you think every DAO should follow when figuring out what the best design is for that specific DAO?
This is a fun one. I think we're very much in the process of like figuring this out as an ecosystem. We're probably going to see over the next couple of years, like a lot of DAOs die because they either could have been companies or way overly index on certain parts of like these democratic sort of vote on everything type systems. I think ultimately a lot of this stuff is going to be about balancing when it makes sense to include and ask for input from groups of people. And other times when it's like, okay, no, you just need to be making decisions and getting shit done. And I think that is a really important first principles type thinking that we as an industry need to be doing more of, but that also creates, like, I think really powerful constraints for how you can think about designing organizations.
Yeah. And I think like the one differentiator too is what are the most common practices we've seen and what are potentially the best practices moving forward. And I think there's a huge delta there that we are hopefully helping, bring us closer to. But I would say like the most commonality we've seen among DAOs is essentially sort of this token republic model where you have a body of token holders that are doing more referendum style votes to have these sort of democratic systems and large groups of people making a lot of decisions. We've seen that come to life through the governor contract, which is sort of the standard contract for on-chain token voting. And then we also see that through a snapshot, which is more of like an off-chain model of that. So that's like pretty much, I would say, the most widely adopted model that DAOs have used. And that's kind of like the go-to system. But as Chase identified, that's not necessarily the best model for all organizations. And I think that's where we're going to see a lot of DAOs die off is they're basically, John's favorite term is like foot gun themselves, like they've shot themselves in the foot in their scaling capabilities due to some of the like infrastructure and bureaucracy that they've introduced at potentially the wrong time or not correctly addressing their priorities as an organization.
Yeah, so I totally agree. And I think maybe one of the ways that we can help DAOs better think about how to design their systems that they're using is with this new model that you guys have been talking a lot about at Metropolis, which is thinking about DAOs as cities. And this isn't anything totally novel. We've seen things like HabnDAO, for example, talking about this for, months or years or however long they've been around. I think a few other organizations as well have really been pressing on this idea of DAOs or about digital spaces in general as physical cities and making that link. But for anybody who's unfamiliar with that concept, can you start out by just explaining, not even in the context of DAOs, but just in the context of digital spaces generally, what are some of the key properties that we know of physical cities and how are we seeing these properties develop in the digital space?
Yes. This is also the first time we're talking about digital cities on any like podcast. So this is exciting. Yeah. So the digital cities sort of thesis came out of John was doing some thinking as we were moving into our rebrand and was very much thinking about this like Steve Jobs using like the bike as this way of thinking about computers and how things were going to change. And that brought up this idea of cities, which, to your point, FWB, Chapman, and a few others that we really respect in the space have been pushing and exploring this narrative. And what felt really exciting about it, as just like a little bit of context more broadly, is that I think as an ecosystem, we look at really skeuomorphic models, for example, DAOs as companies, or even like DAOs as governments. And that can be really helpful, but it also limits us in a lot of ways. And so cities felt like this really expansive way to think about and look at not just DAOs, but also the digital landscape that we're in. So just as some broad context there, a lot of the thinking around digital cities goes back to this idea that I mentioned earlier, that we are now spending like years and years of our lives online. I think the average person a few years ago was spending something like 7.5, 8 hours a day online. I'm sure since the pandemic, that's gone up even more. And so if you're spending most of your waking hours in digital spaces, the hope is that those spaces are actually crafted for you in a way that's sort of optimized for humans to like basically live in them and inhabit them in the same way that cities are crafted to be these spaces that people can thrive in, inhabit, live in, and all of those pieces. And so when you start to see these digital spaces as something more like cities, what you can actually start to do is see them as what cities are, which is incredibly complex systems filled with lots of different, not just individual people, but groups of people, some of them very defined as things like businesses, churches, cultural groups, things like banks and institutions. And as you bring all of these things together, what you actually get is something really magical, which is emergent properties. And that happens with any complex system where effectively you have lots of different groups coming together, each specializes in something. And so what ends up happening is that the outcome is essentially greater than the sum of all of the individual parts. And that's exactly how we see basically like the Web3 landscape evolving over time. I would say what's interesting when we think about it in that way is that each individual DAO, each individual project, each individual NFT, PFP, whatever, those things all come together to create this really, really complex and rich ecosystem that helps humans thrive in these spaces that hopefully are more democratically governed instead of sort of being instantiated and owned by individual companies, which then effectively control the laws of physics in these spaces. So we can get into the sovereignty and borrowed land piece, but that lays some of the groundwork for how we think about digital cities.
I will also just say that if you have not read Chase's Digital Cities piece, it is absolutely incredible. And I was very grateful to watch her process and landing on this thesis. So highly, highly recommend reading the full thing. But I think, again, to emphasize, a key part in the sort of digital cities narrative and adding to this was creating more tangible narrative around DAOs, because I think even after the 10 million essays that came out around what is a DAO, it's still really not tangible to your average user of what is this thing and what's happening here. And I think cities provide a really interesting framework to think about how we are connecting and how we're cohabitating and building digital spaces to serve us all, that utilizes shared infrastructure, that has different localities of governance, that has small businesses, that has major businesses that are distributing services across the city, that has different neighborhoods and locuses of control and activity. These are all sort of the characteristics that make up DAOs that I think provides a much more granular framework to think about how we can better build out these spaces. And that's a huge part of what we're thinking about and how we can basically scale these digital cities and these digital activity hubs.
Yeah, and I think another beautiful thing about digital cities is that you're not bound by physical means, right? So a digital city can comprise of people from New York City, from LA, from Singapore, from Dubai, from all over the world. And in that way, the city becomes even more enriched with its thinking and its innovation, because you are bringing together people with lots of different backgrounds and perspectives, much more so than you can even in a big city like New York City, which is already very diverse and, contains people from all over the world. But digital cities, I think, open up an even higher level of that ability. I do want to go back to something that, Chase, you were talking about earlier. You briefly mentioned this concept of sovereignty and borrowed land. This is something that I read in your article on digital cities that you published on Mirror. You talk about this concept of borrowed land as most digital spaces in the Web 2 world exist on borrowed land. And this is something that we're trying to solve in Web 3, because Web 3 enables these digital spaces to be sovereign instead of to exist on borrowed land. Can you dive into that a little deeper and explain what you mean by that?
Yes. So essentially, the idea here is that, to your point, one of the beautiful things that happens when you have cities is you have people from all different spaces. And there's actually evidence that links diversity of thought and perspective, density of a population, and those things actually combining to create more innovation in cities, which is part of the reason that people love living in cities. Companies are often based there, all that stuff. One of the things that's really important about that, though, is that you need those groups to be able to interact with one another. And so cities provide a container for that, which is really great. One of the biggest challenges with spaces in Web 2 is that they're basically instantiated on what we call borrowed land. Now, that has lots of strong connotations outside of this specific context, which we'll be writing more on. But essentially, the idea here is that you don't actually own the digital spaces that you exist in on Reddit, on Facebook groups, on Discord, because ultimately, in just a quick decision, Discord could choose to shut down your community. They could choose to limit certain even API access. You can't actually bring that group of people with you to different spaces in a really simple way, in the way that you can in a physical city where we go to, a restaurant as a group and then we decide to go to some other club or space or whatever. And so one of the things that's actually really interesting about Web3 is that it creates this instantiation of digital spaces, or it creates the ability to have an instantiation of digital spaces that are on chain And by being on chain, they're actually sovereign in that instead of saying, okay, well, technically my group was instantiated on Discord and now I have to figure out how to flip that over to Patreon or Reddit, you can actually just have these different platforms read from the chain itself. And you can also have individuals who are members of those groups have ownership and control over that group itself. And so it seems like a subtle difference when you think about it in theory, but in practice, it actually unlocks some really, really amazing things where you start to see a lot more almost like entropy of different groups that can interact with each other in different environments. And you start to see the dynamics of these systems completely change. As just a quick side note, one of the things that really matters, and I talk about this in the piece about enabling new properties to emerge out of systems, is that you need these types of interactions to happen in order to create net new outcomes. And that's how you get systems to be greater than the sum of their parts, is actually to allow for these really cool interactions between them. The more that you're able to do that in these digital spaces, we're actually going to start to see a lot more net new outcomes and net new emergent properties, where sovereignty is not just sovereignty for the sake of sovereignty, which I think we tend to see in the space a lot, where people just sort of use this narrative of sovereignty as justification for what we're doing, which is very fair. Sovereignty is powerful. But sovereignty also enables actually really, really wonderful things to emerge out of systems that you otherwise basically can't have if these spaces are not instantiated on their own sovereign pieces of land.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like this concept of sovereignty and ownership is something that we've talked about a lot on the podcast too, mostly from the perspective of creators being able to own their own content, their own data. I think what you're talking about with digital cities is sort of the same thing. It's just taking it up a notch. And instead of talking about the creator individually, we're talking about a whole group of creators, of operators, of different kinds of people who make up your digital city. Julia, so I'd love to hear from you about, like how this rebrand from Orca to Metropolis happened. Was it really this idea, this like thinking of DAOs as cities that brought you guys to this rebrand, or how did that come about?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the biggest part for us was how do we create more tangible like frameworks around DAOs? And I think as Chase just beautifully articulated, there's a really, really powerful messaging with digital cities. And I think to kind of a point you made earlier, Diana, around what's really cool about the digital space is we're no longer landlocked to our geographic location. So it's no longer like Singapore and New York and London. It's like we basically get to start to create the city of cities where everything is connected. And that's not really something we've been able to tap into fully because of the landlock that exists in Web 2. You can't go from Reddit to Facebook. Those cities are not interoperable in any way, shape, or form, unfortunately. And we have a really unique opportunity in crypto to create more interoperable systems. And so the way in which we sort of think about Metropolis in the framework of digital cities is that Metropolis is helping define the map. And in order to sort of like navigate your city correctly, you need to know where you're going and how you're getting there. And what's different is that we're doing it in a completely open and composable and sovereign way. Whereas, Facebook technically said that they were doing the same thing. We're helping map your social networks, but that is completely landlocked to like the region of Facebook. Much of the organizational layer is still really undefined in crypto. We don't really know like what neighborhoods exist, where these activity centers, what the infrastructure is, and also like who inhabits these spaces. And so Metropolis's core feature set allows for relationality and connectivity to basically further develop this organizational layer that we basically see encapsulated in either like the legal system today or in Web 2 structures, like Chase called out, like Discord communities, Facebook groups, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a really cool opportunity we have. And again, like we sort of see ourselves as building the open and interoperable map so that we can build greater connectivity and relationality among these sort of hubs of activity.
Yeah, and something you mentioned is like you're helping develop these relational, like heavy emphasis on the relational, on the people. And that's something that Metropolis, even back when it was Orca, really focused on was this ultimate goal of building human-centric building blocks for DAOs. So I'm curious, can you give some examples, like some tangible examples of ways in which you define human-centric and that you'd like to see human-centric design play out in the DAOs that are built on Metropolis?
Yeah. So, okay, we gave you like really broad overview of macro, what are digital cities? Like a lot of it sounds very sort of like, oh, sure, like think on your little whatever. But I think when we get really tactical, what this actually looks like is humans still inhabit digital spaces. And so at the end of the day, the question is like, what are digital cities? Who are they made up of? Like very tactically, what does this mean? Ultimately, we think basically that the core unit that matters in something like a digital city is essentially a small group of people working together. This is true in physical cities as well, right? You have individual people, but often the things that emerge out of these things are like little offices or, the group of friends that you're sitting with at, a bar or whatever. And so pods are essentially your way of defining those groups on chain. And by doing that, you're actually like instantiating these like digital spaces with a group of people. And so when we think about what it means to be like human centric, what we're really talking about here is acknowledging that 5 people collaborating on something is actually a building block for creating all of these different spaces. And that's actually where most of the value is happening. One of the things that we think a lot about or have thought and talked a lot about is that when we think about like something like, the gig economy, this is John Hillis has also talked about this, and I credit him with a lot of this. Your individual unit of like sort of labor is a person. So it's an Uber driver or someone who's riding in an Uber. And that's creating these like net positive sort of interactions. When we think about like knowledge work and what it means to exist online, it usually is not an individual, it's actually a group of people. And so if the atomic unit of collaboration online is groups of people, we need ways to represent that. And that's exactly what pods are. They're a protocol for representing groups of people on chain in a sovereign way.
What I love that you call out too is like, I think we have really clear user patterns for end users being like first order citizens or first order like recognized entity. We don't really have the same for groups of people. And I think like what is made clear in like Jonathan Hillis's work and like a lot of organizational design is it's basically just a bunch of building blocks of groups of people and groups of dynamic teams or people that have like a collective and cohesive working relationship with one another. And I think that is like a big part of what we're doing is making groups of people like first class citizens, which isn't really a pattern that has emerged yet among the space.
And I would add to that as just a quick side thing. I think when you don't recognize those groups of people, what you end up with is systems that don't work well because the nature of most knowledge work and things like that we're doing digitally are not like single player for the most part. What you end up with is basically like, I'm not saying that this doesn't work, but I think we had a pendulum swing from doing a lot of bounties, for example, in DAOs to being like, okay, wait, maybe bounty work is not the core atomic unit of all DAO work. And I think one of the challenges there was we lacked this like high fidelity framework for representing humans that work together on chain in a way that's legible and understandable. At the same time, when you have only token voting for all decisions, that is also a bad system because you're not representing the fact that small groups of people are probably experts in certain things and should be trusted to make decisions on them. And so I think when you're able to like tangibly represent this group of people, that's not necessarily going to be where all of the governance happens in these orgs, but it is adding this like layer that is incredibly useful for decision making, governance, all that stuff. To Julia's point earlier, regardless of how democratic or autocratic you are, that is going to be a useful layer.
Can you help us better understand in a tangible way what pods are? Because I think, like you said, so far DAOs have been really focused on the bounties and the thing itself. And maybe it's because that's an easier thing for people to conceptualize. Here's a bounty, do this task, you complete it, and you get paid. This is a very straightforward way of thinking about it. But when you put humans at the center of it, like what exactly are we talking about? What work are we getting done? Can you explain more tangibly for people who haven't experienced Metropolis yet, what a pod actually is, what it means to be a first-class citizen in a digital city, part of this pod, and how that plays out. As much as you can. I know a lot of it is you just have to experience it for yourself, but as much as you can verbalize it, can you help us understand, for people who are like, wow, this sounds great, but it's like so like theoretical, like high level for me right now, and I want to understand how this looks in a practical way.
Yes, absolutely. I think that is a very fair question. The way that we think about pods, and kind of tapping on Chase's last comment, is like we're completely agnostic in the way in which these groups work together. Like we don't really care what structure you take on, and like the way in which you're communicating, the way you're working together, the way you're making decisions. What pods do is help build the container and the vehicle to create these interlocking building blocks and units of organization that can click together and scale to build out these larger organizational graphs. So that's kind of, again, like the higher level framework. But technically, what a pod is a permissions layer around a Gnosis safe that has special smart contracts that allow for interoperable building blocks and building relationality between these units. And so like that is the key infrastructure that pods provide, is that connectivity between the pods. Chase, do you want to add any other color?
Yeah, I would say so basically, like Julia said, pods are a wrapper around a Gnosis safe. So if you spin up a new pod, you're actually on the back end both spinning up a Gnosis safe, but also each pod has members. And so people who are members of a pod are actually signers on your Gnosis safe multisig. That ability to be a signer is represented using an NFT. Each pod is their own custom NFT. So all of the members of, for example, a Rehash pod are going to have it, it might be your editor, your producer, you, Diana, and a couple other people. They're going to each have a unique NFT that's a Rehash NFT. And what's cool about things like that is not only does it establish this group of people on chain, you get the benefits of that you would have with the Gnosis safe, which is like a shared bank account, all of that stuff. But you also actually have this really tangible membership that you can then use, for example, with snapshots. So you can say, okay, we're going to do a snapshot vote with the people within this pod and do this governance. But instead of doing it with like a token or whatever, which you can also do, again, not mutually exclusive at all, really intended to be plug and play like Julia is talking about, where you can add them together in a modular way. But you can do all this cool stuff basically when you put things like pod memberships on chain. I also always love to give the example that like what this starts to create is this like tangible graph of trust and human collaboration, which is really exciting for things like under collateralized loans in the future and stuff like that. Like you can sort of build on top of this. But I think when we think about like pods more broadly and sort of what Julia was talking about, it really is about adding these like groups in a tangible way on chain, being able to do a bunch of different things once you've done that.
I love that. Yeah. And I think that helps us understand a lot better from like a more practical perspective what pods are and how people can use Metropolis and all that good stuff. So hopefully we'll see a public launch soon so that we can all get onboarded on. In the meantime, I'll let you do the plugs at the end. Let's move on for now. So last thing I want to talk to you guys about is sort of just like zooming out a little bit more. I'd love to get your take on sort of the future of DAOs. And so Chase, I know you used to work full time for a number of DAOs and you were really plugged into this ecosystem. How have you seen DAOs evolve over, let's just say, the past year?
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting things for me has been watching a lot of the ecosystem go from, a lot of hype. Everyone was like, contribute to a DAO, it's going to be amazing, all this stuff, to, okay, we actually need to make this work and we need to figure out not just what's going to work for us and how to scale, but also like what patterns are we pulling in from companies and governments that do and don't make sense and all that stuff. And I think one of the biggest things that I've noticed personally in the space has been we saw this rise of like the monolithic DAO, where you are a DAO, you have your contributors, you have your community. Those are really blurry lines. You also have token holders and you sort of have everyone in your Discord and that's where you're coordinating all your work and all that stuff. I think we're slowly starting to see that unravel a little bit and start to sort of unbundle. I think something that's really exciting to me in that regard is like seeing more service DAOs pop up and really thinking about these organizations in a more modular way. So like when we think about things like cities, you have like a dry cleaner and you have a bank and you also have a therapist, and there's no reason those things need to be combined into one organization. And I think that's something that I get really excited about, is seeing more specialization in the space so that DAOs don't have to build out these huge monolithic communities and contributor bases, and instead starting to see a lot more specialization in the space, as well as hopefully a little bit less token voting for decisions that don't make sense to do token voting on. And I think one of the ways that we're seeing that unfold is some of the optimistic governance stuff.
Honestly, I would love to see every DAO have their own therapist, because I think that's
Yeah.
so needed.
That might
It would be
actually
highly
be an
used.
example of what's good. Yeah.
Yeah.
But generally, people should also have their own therapists.
Yes.
Both
yes.
is optional.
Yeah. But
This is
I would
a
love to see
mental
that.
health awareness campaign officially.
I would love to see that be like the first benefit that DAOs provide to their contributors, is like a therapist, like a BetterHelp therapist or like an online therapist. Anyway, so do you see any of those trends continuing on into the future, or do you see any new trends pop up, Chase? And then Julia, I'm going to hit you with that question after too.
So I think we're going to see the rise of the service DAO. I think we will start to see like which types of specialty services are going to be best to be within a DAO versus outside of it. I think we're very much figuring that out. And then also, I think one of the ways to mitigate the annoying elements of token voting and how bureaucratic it is to start delegating power to things like pods. So, instead of saying like, okay, well, token holders can basically control these specific smart contract parameters. Instead, you can actually just have a pod have the ability to change certain smart contract parameters, and you can have token holders vote who is on that pod. That's one of the things that's nice about pods. They have like all these capabilities of being able to do stuff like that. And like ENS, for example, uses something like token holders being able to vote who's on a pod. And so in any case, point being, I think what we're going to start to see is the delegation of power away from not token holders in the sense that they don't have control, but away from them in the sense that they don't have to make every single decision. And I think what that ultimately kind of moves closer towards is something like optimistic governance with domain specific decision makers. And I'm hoping that that's something that we'll see a lot more of. I think that's not only going to scale much better, but I also think it's going to end up creating much more like efficient governance patterns so that token holders can direct their attention towards much sort of higher ROI type of decisions.
Yeah. I would add on to some of the maybe bad patterns we've seen in DAOs, and hopefully like better future patterns, is that I think a big risk vector our team has identified that a lot of people don't talk about is just this huge gap in sort of like the socialware and trustware. And what I mean by that is, are you relying on a human to uphold the decisions made by the organization, or are you relying on trustless execution to maintain like scalable, transparent, and trusted decision making? And I think we see like a huge delta in that, in like what DAOs are socially building themselves on versus the actual execution powers that exist. And I think generally like there's a pretty big delta among like the DAOs we've seen emerge in the last year. And to be perfectly honest, I wouldn't say I was like the most hyped on the DAOs that birthed in the last year, because I think that they just birthed from like a different place where people got very excited about like the social structures that they enabled and didn't really care about the scaling of them. And so I actually feel that like the majority of those DAOs that were created in that era will probably die out in the next like few years, because they kind of built themselves on this like social system that doesn't really have like a scalable way to execute on that. I think like what I specifically mean on that is that we just rely so much on like human executors, when like the whole point of the blockchain is that we have like automated code execution abilities and like this trusted ledger that we can all rely on to do the things that we agree on as groups, as actors, as individuals that interact with like the sovereign trust system. And when we start to just rely on like a human for that in our organization, it's like, we're not really even using like crypto at that point. We're kind of just like using the meme and like the lore of a DAO to build out this system without actually like using the scaling capabilities that exist here. So I would say we're probably going to see like a lot of DAOs die, but I think, and I'm hoping it will sort of bring awareness to some of the underlying systems that exist. And I think, again, that's something we're very, very focused on Metropolis is how are we creating legibility around these organizations? Because when you start to like examine these orgs just like a little bit closer, you're like, holy fuck, this looks pretty ugly under the hood. Like if people knew the type of stuff that we like see in DAOs and some like operational and security patterns that exist, like I don't think people would be like super stoked on what's actually happening under the hood.
Yeah, no, I totally hear you on that. And I think that's something that Rehash can definitely work on as well too, is figuring out how to maybe automate a lot of our processes more and make better use of blockchain technology. And I think a big part of it too is, when you're a non-technical person, or even when your DAO is sort of predicated on this non-technical community and you lack, the engineers and the devs in your community to help out with this stuff. As things stand today, I think it's still a challenge for people to fully utilize the tools that are out there. But that's why I'm excited for tools like Metropolis and Govern Avenue that are trying to make it easier for DAOs to better utilize blockchain and the tech that we have available in a really, intuitive way where you don't have to understand code and you don't have to understand like the underlying technology and how data works and, like all of these tables and things like that. And you can just one click of a button, form a DAO, spin up a DAO on chain. And it's like a lot more intuitive to set up everything with tech.
I think that's a really good point too, Diana, because I think we're definitely in a bad pattern in that sense of like the most useful tools really only like a developer could interact with. And it's like starting to sort of mimic what we see in traditional systems. Like the most like complex logic you can create around organizations in the real world is via lawyers. And like that is like the highest barrier to entry of building like relational systems and agreements among you and your peers and groups of people. And that is like the amazing opportunity that we have with crypto is like we start to be able to scale that. And you don't need to rely on like legal counsel that's going to charge you $1,000 an hour to build you a boilerplate agreement around a limited partnership. Like these are all things that we can start to automate. And I think you're totally right. It's super important we start building like more human-centric versions of that so that we're not building the same barriers to entry of like acquiring a lawyer is to making a LLC or something like that. We shouldn't need a developer to compute the agreements that we want to create through Ethereum, the blockchain. So I think like that is the golden opportunity. And I think that's like an amazing point is that we really do need to be emphasizing like the human element of this and creating more scalable solutions for your everyday person to build things with friends, offer services to Aave, like whatever it is.
Yeah, I think your analogy with the legal work is spot on. I do think it's really cool that DAOs are working on solving this problem already, because when you think about it, at the very base layer of even signing a wallet transaction, we're not quite there yet. Like that, even that in of itself is not human centric yet, right? Like you go to sign a MetaMask transaction and it's a bunch of gibberish. Like you don't even know what you're signing. There should just be in plain English, do you want to mint this NFT for 0.05 ETH? Like that is all it should say. But instead, there's all this gibberish, and that's how people get scammed so easily because they just click sign, 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 sign. That's what they're used to doing. And then you do that one time on a wrong site and you lose everything. That's something we were talking to Taylor Monahan about on an earlier episode this season. That is like the first thing that we need to solve in this space is making it more human-centric, more intuitive for your general user so that A, the space is safer. Like that is sort of like the base layer is like we need the safety. And then once we've achieved that, then we can start thinking about like, okay, now we're surviving. Now let's build systems to help us thrive. But, it's hard to thrive when you can barely survive. So that's sort of the state of the space. But I think it's really cool that DAOs are stepping up to the plate and making things happen. And hopefully that puts pressure on the base layer tools to also step up to the plate. I know we're coming up on time. I like to end every podcast episode with a series of 5 fun questions. So let's see if we can blow through this.
Diana, these scare me. The last time I did this with you, I absolutely failed.
You did. I remember that now. But it's okay. This time, you have Chase to pick up pieces for you in case you can think of these questions are different. So it might be better this
great.
time. Okay, so first one I have for you is you get to rebrand one thing in Web3 and it's guaranteed to stick. What do you rebrand?
Oh.
Julia's eyes.
Probably Bored Apes.
Everything.
People have the worst perception of them. They're publicly known. I wish that we could use that brand equity that we have with normal people to like make it not like a bunch of asshole rich crypto people paid for these NFTs.
That's a good one. That's a good one. Julia, do you have one?
I feel like the one that comes to mind is just like DAOs. Like it's just such a bad name. And like I love Vitalik, but the man is not great at naming things. And I think we have potentially outgrown the definition he set for us. And it probably creates more confusion than clarity at this point.
Yeah. Do you have any alternatives in mind?
No.
I've thought about
everyone like
too.
Tries to create a new like acronym, and I'm like, no, like on-chain organizations, crypto native organizations, something along those lines.
Something more straightforward and easy to understand. Yeah, I agree with that. Okay, second question. If you could wave a magic wand and any Web3 app, tool, or protocol would immediately appear, what would that be?
I feel like if I was Kevin Iwaki, I would say civil resistance, which is what's coming to mind is like, who do I respect, who I know like have specific things that they know are barriers to entry. And I know Gitcoin's doing work on that. I also, you can tell I've been thinking about mainstream users because my other initial reaction is like, we just need better ways for people to have on-ramps in that are not like a big pain in the ass.
Yeah. One-click wallet creation.
Yeah, in a way that's like not, I don't know, if we could just pre-fund everyone with a little bit of ETH so that they're not.
Yeah. I mean, Lens is kind of doing that by like spinning up a wallet for every new user. Farcaster does that. So I think we're getting there.
Getting there.
Soon, TM.
Soon.
TM. Okay, Julia, do you have one?
I feel like I would say like a human readable ether scan. Like I feel like
that's a good one.
That the chain is legible is like this lore because most people don't even know how to like read the chain or ingest that. So I would probably say like a more human readable ether scan / kind of to your point, Diana, human readable transaction loads within your wallet.
Yeah, 100%. I would love to see that. Okay, next one. If Metropolis were a famous person or animal or character from history or pop culture, who would it be?
This is where I say something stupid, Diana.
This is where we make a meme out of you, Julia. Why do you think I ask these questions?
Oh my God.
All for the content.
Ooh, I don't know.
Not a good answer, Chase.
I know.
Metropolis was a famous person or an animal?
Or a character, like any character.
I have one, but it's dumb.
Okay. Let's hear it.
Oh, I have one too.
One thing that we do on our team a lot is we just do claps. We're clappers. We're big clappers. This is not an animal or a famous person. It's just a movement. Just a little golf clap. That's it. That's like our thing. Like we like to cheer people on. I don't know. That's
like
just
a dolphin, maybe, because they
kind
like
of
to, like,
or do seals do
the
that?
Whale.
Yeah, seal.
Yeah. Whales.
Metropolis is a seal.
Wow, we're going back to the Orca branding. We're really we need something city forward, but we do that.
Okay,
a lot.
I have one.
Okay.
The Jetsons.
Oh yeah.
It's
That
Like,
was a
remember the cartoon,
Yeah.
The Jetsons? It's like a family that like lives in space on like little bubble pods, and they move in their little spacecraft from pod to pod.
yes.
That
I
is
tried tweeting
Metropolis.
that meme from the Metropolis account and it didn't do well. So Diana, if you can meme this into existence.
We'll try again.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
If it fails again, then we just have to drop it.
I'm okay
That'll
with
be our
that.
sign. Okay. Next question. If money were no issue, like if you knew you were financially set for the rest of your life, what would you be doing with your lives?
I already know Chase's answer to this.
Yeah, I would be doing the same thing. I know it's annoying, but this ecosystem is like the most intellectually, and I know it's boring to say that too. It's like, wow, Chase, you should probably get a life outside of crypto, but like it's the most
You
intellectually
said it.
stimulating. Yeah. Yeah, I just love the people. I love I don't know. I love the conversations, everything about this space. It makes me feel like fulfilled, like we're actually working on something important.
Wholesome as
Julia?
fuck. I mean, I'm not gonna lie. I
Please tell me
also
you
love
have
what
more
I do.
Please tell me.
No,
you
don't worry. Don't worry. I've got more of a life than Chase.
Julia's like, I'm not a loser.
Phew.
I will say though, like I was a poli-sci nerd in college. Like I've always been obsessed with this shit. So this does scratch like all the things that I love. But if I were to just, drop everything and do something else, I would be a ceramicist, because I've been doing my little ceramics play clay situation, and it's super fun. I feel like everyone needs to like be more playful in their life and like have a playful activity like that.
I love that for you. I'm going to
Thanks.
manifest this future for you. When
Thank you
Metropolis
so
blows
much.
up and you're like a multi-billionaire, future Julia, ceramicist. Top
Perfect.
ceramicist in the nation.
We need Metropolis merch
see it
that's
now.
like pots.
Yeah.
And handmade by
Just
Julia.
Metropolis mugs. Big
Love
M.
Metropolis
that.
mugs. Yeah.
Yeah. Can make
I
it
love that.
happen.
For sure. Okay. Last question, and we'll get you out of here. If you could live anywhere in the world, where would you live?
Easy. Oh, actually, Sydney, Australia, or Tel Aviv, Israel. Beach vibes. And it's like good coffee culture. They've just got the vibes are immaculate.
Love it.
I don't know where I would live. Julia knows I've gone through a crisis on where I want to live. I wish I had a good answer. I have no idea. I have no idea if I want to live in New York or Chicago or somewhere completely different.
The metaverse.
The metaverse.
Yeah, she wants. I was gonna say that.
On my own sovereign land.
Yeah.
My own little digital city.
I also love that for you too. Before you guys go, tell people where they can find each of you individually if they want to follow you, and also where they can go to learn more about Metropolis and when people can actually sign up for it and how they can do that.
Yes, you can find me personally on Twitter, Jules Rose with Z's, and you can go to metropolis.space to learn more about Metropolis and everything we are cooking up.
And you can find me on Twitter. I'm Chase Chapman, but with an R in between. So it's like Chaser Chapman. And you can also find us on Twitter at 0x Metropolis.
Awesome. Well, thank you both so much for taking the time to come on the podcast today and sharing your wealth of wisdom and knowledge with us. Thank you, listeners, for tuning in. As always, we got to end this episode with a little clap. If you're watching the YouTube, you'll see all of us clap. What is this motion? I was not
This is a recent invention.
Okay. This
is excitement.
Yeah, it's the excitement.
Okay. Fireworks.
Yeah.
Fireworks. Yes.
Okay.
We're
if you're
big
listening to the audio, go on YouTube and watch this. Otherwise, it won't make any sense to you. But anyway, thank you everybody for listening. And we will be back again next Tuesday with a new episode of Rehash.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Rehash, a Web3 podcast. Julia Rosenberg and Chase Chapman were nominated by Joshua Seymour and voted onto the podcast by Karsten, Anay Sim, Ale Borda, Adam Levy, Tim Black, KBW, and other anonymous DAO members. Some of the questions you heard were submitted by Karsten. Rehash is hosted by Diana Chen, produced and edited by Ellie Dots and Tyler Internet, sponsored by Lens, Avenue, and Govern, and as always, supported by Rehash DAO. To stay up to date on all things Rehash, you can follow us on Twitter at RehashWeb3, on Lens at rehash.lens, and join our Discord to get involved.